Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody, to Nightlight. I'm really thankful that everybody made it here tonight. First of all, I really want to thank Ken Quiethawk for that amazing introduction, as always. His website is nativestorytellers.com, and if you've never heard anybody tell some of the native stories, he's an amazing man to listen to, on top of the fact he has a spectacular voice. My guest tonight is Lon Kreger, and he is a retired military man and an expert at digging for facts. He's found a genuine passion for the ancient garden beds of Michigan, and his expansive research gives a new and broader understanding to these mysterious structures. They are amazing. I lived in Michigan for almost 10 years and never knew that they were there. It's kind of one of those things that, antiquity is there, and it smacks you in the face, and it hides in plain sight, and unless you really are paying attention, you walk right by it. And Lon has discovered these amazing flower beds, and they open you to a new understanding as to the people, the ancient people that were here, and how they weren't primitive. They were highly developed, and I think that's one of the things most of us often look at when we're talking about the first people and things like that. We think of them as sort of primitive, and yet these flower beds covered anywhere from 20 to 300 acres, and how they did it and why they did it is an amazing story, and I'm so glad that he's here to tell the story tonight. So welcome to the show, Lon.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. It's great to be with you again. It's been a crazy, hectic day for both of us, I think. But
yes, it
has. I'm delighted that you invited me on. Thank you very much.
Well, I think it's so important because, when you think of flower beds, you think, what's the big deal? But it's a tremendous deal, especially if it isn't just flowers that are growing. But you've come across these flower beds in Michigan and in other states as well, and they were developed and tended by a people that history doesn't report on, which is a very sad thing.
Right. Well, let me clarify. These are not flower beds. These are
garden beds. Garden beds.
These were ancient garden beds that they grew on an industrial scale, according to Dr. David Overstreet and Dr. Philip Graham and Dr. Denovan out of the University of Wisconsin and Menominee Native College in Upper Wisconsin. And these garden beds, they were named as garden beds by Henry Schoolcraft and Bella Hubbard and some other researchers and surveyors in the early 1800s, circa 1828 and forward. And these garden beds were, people realized that the Europeans who came and in the old world, traditional farming was done by plow in simple, straightforward rows. And as you can see from the photographs and previous articles that I've written, what is so fascinating about these beds, as you so beautifully pointed out in your intro, is that these garden beds were giant spoke wheel-shaped or arrowhead-shaped, labyrinthine-shaped geometries built in a raised row platform higher than we typically build or plow a row. They fashioned these rows at about 18 to 24 inch heights and on a 20 to 300 acre scale, according to Henry Schoolcraft when he first surveyed these in the early 1800s. And their gardening style has come down to us to the present day through a score of Native American groups from the Seneca tribe in Pennsylvania, the native tribes of New England and across the Great Lakes, and the Ohio Valley region. And they farmed anciently and right up to modern times in a garden farming format known as the Three Sisters form of gardening. And this system of planting in these raised garden beds involved, and among the Ojibwa, it's called Giitigiang. It's very hard to pronounce for non-native speakers, meaning the Three Sisters forms. And the way they would plant is they would take kernels of corn and plant in the center of the hill. And if you have any pictures going on YouTube or on your site that we had up previously of the giant spoked wheel, they would plant the corn. They would plant that corn in the center on the top of the hill, and somehow these people were so expert, they understood that corn literally sucks the nitrogen out of soil as it grows. And so to compensate for that soil chemistry deficiency, they would then plant beans at the base roots of the corn and allow the beans vines to climb the corn stalks, which is brilliant, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
and then in order to help reinforce the whole process and the soil chemistry with the beans, they would plant squash in those spokes, radiating outward, and then many times they would also plant sunflower seeds on the outer ridge. Now, the academic archaeologists like Overstreet and some others, they saw the beauty in this, and it's really genius when you consider it. For instance, in upper Wisconsin, which is really obviously just east of the Minnesota plains, as it were, they got terrific winds and still do, right, blowing across the northern plains region. So by planting sunflower seeds and stalks to the outer rim, if you will, of the garden plot and plat area, and then having the beans grow up around the corn stalks, one of the benefits was that it helped shield the corn production from high winds that had a tendency to blow corn over. So the sunflowers would take the beating first, then the bean vines would help sort of like tie down the root base of the corn and help it maintain its base. And beyond that, what they have since discovered, which is quite fascinating, and you don't have to be a garden person, I don't think, to appreciate these ancients, because for me, it was a question of, wow, why did they farm with such amazing geometry? First of all, that's what captured my interest. And second, what are all the other benefits of doing this way? Because if you look at that massive spoked wheel, I doubt very seriously that we have very many farmers today, one, who would decide to farm in such a geometry, and two, it would be a very interesting problem for them to plow and raise garden beds in a spoked system like that, wouldn't it? With the mechanical tractors and harvesters we have today.
Well, yeah, I think what fascinates me is, I mean, some of these bed layouts are so intricate, it's almost like a patchwork quilt. And,
right.
It's brilliant. And on top of that, the fact that they helped to protect them from frost, so that, I mean, those raised beds served many purposes. And not only that, but the fact that they put pottery shards in there too, to help, give the roots something to grab onto, which was another thing that is brilliant. I mean, I garden, and I've had I've tried corn once or twice, and always it blew over, and you can't stake it up. Once it's gone, it's gone. So
because of the shallow root base.
Yeah. So, it was kind of like, well, we don't do this one again. But it was sort of like, why not? I have the garden. Let me just put corn in, and a hurricane came through, and the corn was gone. But
whereas the low base plants tend to survive sometimes.
Oh yeah, they were just fine. So what you've got here is brilliance, total brilliance.
Right.
And I mean, you over the years, over the thousands of years that they did this, and it was 1,000 years at least, I think, wasn't it?
At least.
Close to. Yeah.
I think our research will probably soon take us back to 2,000 and 3,000 BC. Right now, Overstreet, they've been going so slowly through the stratigraphy of some of these beds and sending like every inch off to a professor at the Smithsonian who developed a special spectrographic procedure, microscopic procedure. And she's like a pathologist. She can look at the phytoliths of the seed starches and tell you how ancient they were and their origins and so forth. And what they have found, taken it back thus far, just the very, say, top, I think he's saying the top 8 centimeters, 3 or 4 inches. They've gone back as far as 500 and 600 AD presently, but we know that they just didn't invent them at that moment in time, right? They had obviously been doing this for a much longer period, and I maintain in my research, as a result of my research, in connecting the dots, that these people were the grocery store supply chain to the ancient copper miners and traders who came from the Mediterranean region, that's primarily up the Mississippi and down the St. Lawrence Seaway anciently 3,000-4,000 years ago. They were the food suppliers to these ancient copper traders. And as you indicated about the pottery fragments from our last discussion a few months ago, since they have since discovered, as you rightly pointed out, that not only were the beds raised sufficiently high enough to keep the roots out of the frost, the deep frost zone, and also the pottery fragments helped reinforce the root bases, as you pointed out. But they've since discovered that the troughing effect between the rows provided a natural course irrigation channel, and Overstreet says they are dazzled by the hundreds and hundreds of rows that they found in the forest near Wolf Creek River, for instance, on the Menominee Reservation. And he says what's amazing is it would have taken millions of basket loads of river bottom mud and muck that they constantly reinforced and resupplanted onto their garden beds year after year, season after season. And they were further struck recently when they found a whole series of garden row beds near Wolf River on bedrock. And they were astonished that they would set them on bedrock. And he said, we came to discover the reason why. He said turned out the bedrock provided an actual reflective base for bounce back heat, subheating of the roads. So, and what was additionally amazing is they discovered that their pottery, unlike anywhere else in the region or the country, is what they call shell-tempered pottery, made from crushed shell, snail shells and clam shells and so forth, as opposed to a granite clay base type of pottery that we see elsewhere in the mounds, for instance. And this shell-based pottery turns out chemically that when they would mash their corn or their bean meal and so forth, they got a natural uptake of additional calcium in their diet, which kept them from being malnutritioned. So these people knew what they were doing.
They did. Now, of course, the question, I know that, the last, 8,000 years, 9,000 years, the copper mines have been in production. So where did these people come from that tended these gardens?
Well, according, and this is really a big breakthrough, and Overstreet in one of his lectures, I noticed he really stands his ground, and he says these people in the Wisconsin area were, quote, on the landscape for 10,000 years or more. So, but it also appears that there is another culture, and he calls it the second culture, that also came to, that was parallel or interacted with this ancient group of garden builders. And so really, I think we can safely conclude from the evidence thus far that these people were already here when the copper traders started coming. And it appears that there was an influx of another ancient people that sailed in. And by the way, the Native American traditions are just full of this oral tradition of these migrations from the East Sea and beyond the East Sea, which would be the Atlantic, and so forth. For instance, in the Ojibwa tradition, they are called the people of the three fires, and they have what they call the prophecy of seven fires, or the seven fires prophecy. And in their first prophecy, which is their, and second prophecy, speaks to their origin story, they talk about how their people came from far beyond the East Sea, from a land in tribulation or chaos, and they came on 8 dishes or 8 turtles, which is very interesting. And the Ojibwa Chippewa were part of the vast Algonquin nations originally of the New England region, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and so forth, and they did not arrive in Michigan until the early 1500s, and they came to a place known as Saginaw Bay area, and they basically virtually exterminated the Potawatomi people of that region, and there were a couple hundred Potawatomi refugees that basically hot-footed it down to southwest Michigan. Now, if you look at one of the pictures I sent, I don't know if you were able to post it, there's a map of Michigan, and it shows in red in southwest Michigan the watershed region of southwest Michigan, and that's basically the area where the Potawatomi went. They subsequently worked their way around Lake Michigan and back up into Wisconsin, but we're talking in the 1500s and 1600s and so forth. It turns out that the Menominee people were the people that preceded them all. There's also a group called the Sauk, Ho-Chunk Sauk, and some of the Winnebago Nation, in their traditions, they feel that they came, and this is very interesting, from the other side of the old world, namely Chinese influence.
Wow.
And there's a Dr. Joan Price out of the University of Wisconsin who did a thesis on it back in, I think, 91, and did a fascinating thesis looking at some of the Sauk Fox oral traditions, their language, and she traced all the way back to a cave in Xiangshan, China area, I believe it was, and it's a massive painted mural that dates back a couple thousand years, and it very plainly shows a Native American with a Mohawk-style head arrangement, and 2 other Native Americans, I think with a spear and so forth, juxtaposed against a Chinese, I want to say the word right, Shaoshan priest and merchant. And of course, in Chinese tradition, they had sailed to this land many centuries ago, and then there's, of course, the famous book, 1421, about the vast Chinese sailing fleet. So that's another subject. But I think what my study has led me to think about this is when you talk to most Native Americans, and my family line on my grandfather's side happens to be Creek and Choctaw and Cherokee influence from the South, which is a whole nother neat story about where the Creek came from. And we've kind of, a guy by the name of Richard Thornton in Georgia is a really top-notch researcher in the area of the Creek origins, and he has shown that they came out of the Norwegian region of Osland and so forth, and many of our cultural words and the building of our ancestral roundhouses are completely reflective of Laplanders. So keep that in your gray matter, because that's another origin story. But remember that the world, many millennia ago, I originally did my undergraduate work as a geologist at the University of Arizona many decades ago, and in archaeology and anthropology there. And in archaeology or geology 101, they tell you that all the continents were one piece many millennia ago, before plate tectonics really began its surge, and the plates, of course, separated the major continents. And that was known originally as Pangea. Later, after a separation, geologists refer to it as Gondwanaland. And that's when you got the Indian subcontinent breaking off with Australia. So the upshot is, the native people say that this is not the New World, that was the Old World. Or that this, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. This is the Old World, okay, America, the North American continent, and Asia is the New World. And so even in Egyptian history and oral tradition, you'll recall, I'm sure, on shows you've done in your own research, that in the Egyptian world, you were always buried facing west, because they would journey to where the sun set. And because that's where we came from. Okay? And so they knew in their traditions that this land existed. See, and what people need to understand, and they never got in history class, is what they did get is, everybody thought the world was flat at the day of Columbus. What they didn't teach and didn't know, most of them, was that most of the major empires and cultures before that, they did not have, with the exception of some of the Greeks and Romans, they did have legends of falling off the edge of the earth and things like that. But many of the groups did not. The early Phoenicians, they were not necessarily afraid to sail anywhere, and so they were the ones, along with the Minoans, 2000 BC, 2400 BC, and so forth, who had no fear of sailing to this continent and mining copper. And so I think the people were already on this landscape for thousands of years, and many archaeologists and geologists would say, oh, that's baloney, because the ice ages were so preeminent and so vast that, the people, well, it was obvious. They would just move south with the flow of the ice. As the ice increased, the animals were forced southward, and so were humans. And as they retreated, they had this beautiful opportunity to follow the rivers and lakes that formed behind them to fish and so forth. So I feel that the people were on this landscape, many of them, hundreds of thousands of them, survived many ice age glacial movements and remained on the landscape all over North America. And yes, there were various periods where there were die-offs due to, for instance, in the Southwest today we have the hantavirus, and that hit the Pueblo nations 1,000 years ago probably, where there were outbreaks caused by pack rats and rats and small rodents that carry the hantavirus in their dung and so forth. And even today, there's always a case or two every year where someone contracts the hantavirus from breathing in these unseen spores. So there would be, ebbs and flows like there always have been in history, with contractions and expansions of human population and so forth. What's interesting in that vein is that when we're talking about the Little Ice Age, which occurred around the 1400s in North America, it's fascinating that Overstreet and his group says, we see no evidence whatsoever that the Neo-Boreal Ice Age of the 1400s had any impact on the ancient garden builders of Wisconsin whatsoever. Now, that's pretty amazing. And so I also want to mention that what really got me started into this research were these beautiful geometric garden beds of southwest Michigan, what came to be called the Kalamazoo garden beds, but they ranged all the way up near Saugatuck and down to Three Rivers, and there are a couple schoolcraft documented up near Sanilac, Saginaw Bay, and a couple interspersed elsewhere. But the vast majority were the whole southwest Michigan area, which when the pioneers came said was some of the most beautiful farmland they had ever seen. And curiously enough, in parallel to it, one of the Potawatomi chiefs in the early 1800s was a man by the name of Chief Pokagon. And one of the early pioneers documented much of their interactions. But he was so highly regarded, there was an ancient trail, virtually a native highway, if you will, from Lake Michigan on the west, near Niles, Michigan, I think it goes, all the way east to Lake Erie and beyond. And it came to be known in our day and in the early 1800s as the Pokagon Trail. But this was a trail that basically runners and traders between tribal groups and the mound builders, the Hopewell and so forth, they would use this trail like a major highway between the two, what they considered were oceans, and often referred to them as seas, Lake Erie and Lake Michigan, as you can imagine. So,
well, Lake Michigan is huge.
Oh, yeah, as is Lake Huron and Superior, right?
Mm-hmm. No, they are amazing. So, I think what makes me wonder is that one of the things that in what I was reading, of your articles and stuff, that while these gardens were in production for centuries, there was never any indication that there was war. So it was
right.
It was there was peace. It was just. And it's amazing because, we think of the Indians as being kind of, at least the stories go, sort of, questing and fighting amongst themselves and everything. And yet there is absolutely no indication that there was any war during any of the time that these gardens were in production.
Right. That was a startling revelation to Overstreet and Gardner in the course of their research in the last decade or so. They said as they have tried to peel back the history of the garden beds up in Wisconsin, for instance, and we have no ability now to look at the Kalamazoo area beds because our pioneer forefathers erased them all. They were gone by about 1880. But as for the upper Wisconsin beds, that fascinated them, and you and I, rightfully so, because Overstreet says that they produced produce on an industrial scale, number one, and number two, they did it without any evidence of warfare. They have never found any atlatl spearheads, copper or stone, Neolithic stone, no micro flints, no microchips so far, or evidence in or around the garden beds whatsoever. And that was surprising. And he goes on to talk about, as I mentioned earlier, that they lived, it appears that they lived in a peaceful symbiotic relationship with this second culture. And you sort of have to dig your way between the lines to find out that he is referring to another group that came in, of course, and intermarried, probably interbred and so forth. And we know that one of the groups were these ancient Minoan, Phoenician, probably Carthaginian, and various other copper trader mining groups. And so it is astonishing that any culture could get by for 100 years, much less probably 3,000 or 4,000 years, without some kind of either civil war, internecine warfare, or warfare against these people coming in to their area, right?
Yeah.
But and along with that, I maintain now, you see, according to historians and archaeologists, the Copper Bronze Age was ushered in the Old World, in the Mediterranean, Mesopotamian region in particular, circa 750 BC. Well, it apparently, and they don't know why or how it happened, but they'll tell you, the experts, it just sprang up all of a sudden, particularly initially in the island of Malta and the area of Sardinia and Greece and so forth. Well, it sprang up so suddenly in Malta that we know that the people there started making their own copper weapons, and they dispatched and disposed the previous pagan hierarchy that was ruling over them in Malta circa 750 BC range so far. So I maintain that we had our own Copper Bronze Age here, happening here in the Great Lakes region, probably at least 1,000 years before 750 BC. And I think I sent you a whole bunch of pictures just before the show. There's a neat picture in there of some copper sickles, swords, atlatl spear points, all found around Wisconsin. There are literally hundreds of sites in Wisconsin and Michigan where hundreds, I could even get away with saying several thousand copper bronze atlatl spearheads, and we're talking socketed and riveted spearheads that date back 3,000 and 4,000 years. And the way we know that is we have found some that still had stems on them that we could carbon date. And so you still have state archaeologists in different states, and they don't talk to each other, by the way. You know, the Ohio State archaeologists will not interact with West Virginians or Indiana, Illinois, vice versa. So the Ohio State historical people will have one view, a set mindset about their mound builders in Ohio, and while the West Virginia folks may take a whole different approach on who these people were and how long ago it was and so forth. And I say that to illustrate that there, and I'm not going to name them, but there are some who absolutely refuse to allow the dating to go back any further or to admit to the new facts on the horizon that keep coming forth that blow away the old paradigms. They're just not going to have it, see? And academia has to literally be run over by a tsunami of evidence in order to change their paradigm, of course.
Yeah, and then it'll take another generation to alter the history books too. One thing that sort of, there are these huge garden beds, and as you said before, 20 to 300 acres of them. And there were also storage pits for food. So that,
well, yes, indeed. You're right.
That, they're storing, as they're harvesting and stuff like that. But to my knowledge, there has been no uncovering of a huge community and where they lived to tend the gardens.
Well, Overstreet has documented a fair amount of that because they're still getting blown away by what they're seeing. Let me explain how the paradigm has shifted on that score in the last couple of years. As you rightly point out, in Wisconsin in particular, among the Menominee on the Oconto area of the Menominee Nation, it's a rather huge county, Oconto County, and the Menominee Nation is a sizable portion of it, and thankfully they had their rights restored, I think in the 70s or 80s, and they managed to retain a huge amount of forest. And if you look at it from Google Earth or satellite, you'll see tremendous amounts of farmland everywhere up there, and then there's this beautiful forest. But what Overstreet has discovered is when they initially started finding these garden rows, 15, 20 years ago, at first he thought, there's only 100 or maybe a couple hundred of these. Well, since then they've found, I think they're close to several thousand. And as you mentioned, what they were astonished to find is that subsequently in about the last, 6-7 years, I think, they started finding these stone-lined storage pits that you mentioned, and at first they found a few. And then they started finding more. Now they've found hundreds and hundreds of them associated along the bed areas for storage. And so we don't know entirely yet because they haven't completed some of their research, but it appears that, they would store corn and beans and squash and so forth, and probably seeds inside pottery, and then they would probably pack it with leaves during the winter. And in my imagination, I see little wooden rooftop, woven rooftops placed over them and secured down for the winters, and then they would simply remove them, and now they had their seed base with which to work from next, already ready for next year's, the new season's planting. Now, in addition to that, what he's also described that also blew them away is when you look at post-European arrival native groups like the Odawa, Chippewa, and so forth, and Lakota Sioux, the Odawa and Chippewa moving across the upper peninsula of Michigan into the northeast corner of Wisconsin in the mid-1500s to 1600s. There, every day almost, if you read the history of the Ojibwa and the Lakota Sioux, they were, as you spoke earlier, in constant daily battles with each other. And their whole history is rife with them engaging in surprise attacks on each other. But it turns out, according to Overstreet and Gardner, they were amazed once again. We see the native groups, our classical native groups, living in close, clustered, high-density housing, as it were, with their tribal structures. And what blew them away was they were finding post holes for home structures, for residences, that were spread out all across the landscape for miles. In other words, they did not congregate in closely held, circular communities like we've known across the sands of time, from Africa to the Mongol steppes to here. They simply built a structure. They would be blocks or a mile apart many times, he's saying, is what we're finding. And that in itself, of course, is extraordinary. What's also useful to reflect upon in terms of planting and gardening is just as Squanto taught the first pilgrim settlers to use fish as a fertilizer, and this is what saved the pilgrims. In colonial diaries, they speak to being taught how to garden in this land. Squanto and others in Chief Massasoit's tribe were instrumental in teaching them how to use fish fertilizer, or fish emulsion as we call it today. And fish, it turns out, is just about the best fertilizer known to man. And they were able, the pilgrims, to generate 2 and 3 crops in that first season, which was just baffling to them. And so when you consider that among the Menominee Nation today, their name, Menominee, comes from the word Menumen in their language and in the Ojibwa, which means wild rice, or people of the wild rice. And to this very day, the Menominee have little flatboats that they float out on watershed areas, and about 40 to 60% of their diet today is actually wild rice that they harvest on the reservations, and about 40%, 30% of their diet still consists of sturgeon, walleye, and other fish stock, and muskrat and so forth. And so they were big fisher people, and I suspect that somewhere along the way, Overstreet and Company will discover, well, they may not, because cartilaginous fish bone really decays quickly. But I suspect they fertilized their fields heavily with scrap, fish emulsion effect fertilizer in order to generate these crops. And once again, reflect on the fact that they did this on an industrial scale. And what's so amazing about that is he says they were farming tons and tons of garden crops that they could never use. So I use this to connect the dot to the copper traders when you consider that even academics today pretty much agree, I think in general, that they estimate that there were 10,000 copper miners annually in the Keweenaw Peninsula and on Isle Royal, Michigan, in Lake Superior, near Canada, every season for several thousand years. And when you have 10,000 copper miners, or maybe more, what we have not found is any evidence of them building cabins or lodges of any kind. And so Fred Ridholm, in his book Michigan Copper, I think rightly and beautifully summates that these people probably lived on their ships during the mining season. And they would probably trade fish or bear pelts or any number of other products with the ancient Menominee and company, whoever the others were, the ancient Adena and archaic people on the landscape there. They probably traded heavily, and meanwhile, they have apparently they are skilled copper workers, and they're hammering out copper by the tonnage, and they're sharing it and trading these atlatl copperheads with the local garden builders. Now, what's fascinating about the copper traders is that we've been able to validate a great deal of this movement of what academics say is about 2 billion tons of ancient Michigan copper having been moved somewhere. And the academics don't like to talk about the Mediterranean or the Old World because they say we can't prove it, you know. But guess what? It went somewhere, and they all agree on that. Okay, so where did 2 billion tons or 500 million tons of copper go that they know was mined anciently? For instance, on Isle Royal, the DNR estimated that there are over 15,000 6-foot to 30-foot deep copper pits on Isle Royal, which is, I think, 30 miles in circumference or so. It's always been dangerous to walk on Isle Royal because you can trip and fall and break a leg in holes, every 10 feet. And they've lost significant numbers of elk and wolves. They're down to about 15 wolves as of last count, I believe, because the wolves and the other higher species on Isle Royal have just continuously diminished their populations by falling into these pits. Now, to visualize for the audience, these copper pits are not very deep, most of them anciently. On the Keweenaw Peninsula, Fred Ridholm, who researched these things for about 40 or 50 years, he claimed that there were over 1 million of these copper pits, and I'm sure he's right because even today in near Copper Harbor, Michigan, and on Isle Royal in particular, you can find places where these copper pits exist, and you will find literally hundreds of these 2,000-3,000-year-old hammer stones that they used to bash the copper and form it and prepare it for shipment. And part of the way they did this is they would we have an actual illustration in some old texts of like scaffolding. They would find a nugget, and they would simply add scaffolding to it and raise it out of a pit. But they almost never went below 30 feet, and most of the pits were 6 to 10 or 20. But the other thing that the audience needs to know is if you'll, they might be able to see one of the pictures I sent. There's a picture of a 25-ton float copper nugget with about 30 people standing around it that was found about 15 years ago, just lying on top of the ground. And this was common. We have numerous other photographs in the early 1900s to the 50s and 60s, and people are still finding giant nuggets, 6, 8, 10 tons of pure copper. And the Michigan copper is very easy to identify in terms of its matrix, because Michigan copper typically has a small intrusion of silver in it. So Michigan copper compared to the rest of the world's copper is like anywhere from 90 to 97% purity, which means you can smelt it directly and fashion it into anything you want without having to cook it at 2,000 degrees in an iron kiln. And as opposed to, say, the Romans and the Greeks and the Turks, most of the rest of the world's copper, for instance, in Britain and Turkey, is typically 23% to about 38% pure. So it took a tremendous amount of firepower, if you will, to blast off the incrustation of rock and slag to get useful copper. So you can see why these people would invest themselves in their ships and sail here and spend about 3 years on a voyage or so. And they would sail over with giant, or I shouldn't say giant, massive, what we call ballast stones. And they would typically have a circle in the middle, and that would hold the ship at its proper water line on the way over. They would sail up the Mississippi or down the St. Lawrence into Lake Superior, and we know now that, post-glacially, the Chicago River, for instance, and the Wisconsin River and the Autrain rivers in the Upper Peninsula, these rivers were much wider and deeper than they have been in, say, the last 300 or 400 years. And so they could literally sail right up through Chicago into Lake Michigan and stop off at a very mystical place called Beaver Island, which you are aware of, but our listeners may not be. And Beaver Island, in the last 10 years, we have now, courtesy Dr. Bob Schurz and Dr. Bob Liss, have done tremendous research along with some others, and they, I believe, we have located something on the order of 9 what they believe are ancient stone, Minoan-style, Roman-style docking wharfs on the edges of Beaver Island. I also saw a presentation a year or so ago from a lady who had discovered 3 or 4 ancient Minoan birthing stones. They're about the size of a roll-top desk typically, and with a seat literally smoothed out in them where apparently they must have brought their women with them, some of them on their ships, and when they were pregnant, they would sit on these birthing stones, almost like a sofa, lay back, give birth, and there was a birth channel cut into the rock where the aftermath and so forth could flow, and this also became a ritual altar for their pagan goddesses. So then they would proceed up towards Escanaba, Michigan, and literally sail up or through, depending on which direction you came from. They could sail out of Superior through the Autrain River, which becomes the Whitefish River, right through the Upper Peninsula, and sail right down the Mississippi, back to a place in the south in Louisiana called Poverty Point. And what they would do is they would, when they were here in the Keweenaw Peninsula on the very upper tip of Michigan, is where they would do this mining, they had formed stone molds. And recently a fellow in Ohio found an ancient smoothly carved stone mold of a giant sundial. Okay? We have actually got stone molds out of the mounds, in several mounds in Ohio, that still have the forged copper axe heads inside the mold cast. But at any rate, they would take a large stone and etch out what academics have labeled and called and termed oxides. In other words, it kind of looks like when you skin a beaver and you get the 4-leg corners of a skin, that's what their copper oxides would look like. That's how the shape they formed them in, and they would apparently cold hammer these into, I call them like T-shirts, and these were done in a 60-pound format, which they called talents, and they would then cast out their stone ballast stones into the water and then replace them with these rows of 60-pound ballast copper ingots. And how do we know this? Well, in the last 15 or 20 years or so, experts have found 4 ancient sailing vessels, one dating back to about 2500 BC, one dating back to about 1000 BC, and a couple dating from 200 AD and 500 AD, I believe, off the coast of Turkey. And one in particular is off the coast in an area called, and the ship is referred to as the Uluburun ship. And we have beautiful photographs, and you can see them in Ancient American Magazine, I think the December issue of 2017. Jay Wakefield, who is a terrific researcher in this arena and on Poverty Point and on copper navigational devices, he has actually got 20 or 30 handheld ancient copper navigational axe heads, they refer to them as, with dots lines that he has deciphered the actual latitudes and longitudes that they use to navigate here. And he shows in his articles how they navigated to Beaver Island. At any rate, we have photographs of the holds of these couple of these ships with the ancient amphora in them, and here are these excellent 60-pound copper ox hides lying in the holds.
Wow.
Additionally, which is further evidence that the academics have to deal with, I think, is I just found a beautiful picture rendering of an ancient hieroglyph in Egypt at a place called Rekamara, in the tomb, I think, of Pharaoh Keshfuti, and it shows 6 or 7 slaves carrying different objects. And 2 of the slaves are carrying these ox hides on their shoulders.
No.
And this tomb dates back circa 2000 to 3000 BC, I believe. So that's your connecting the dots. I'm trying to connect the dots here for the audience with the ancient copper folks, the Mediterranean, and the ancient garden builders. Now, the other arena that I think the audience might find fascinating is this past year I've been doing a lot of research into the notion of the myth that there were no horses around in North America till the Spanish arrived.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to stamp my foot and say that's a lot of garbage. And so I'd like to explain, touch on this subject if we could, unless you had another question about what we just covered.
No,
I know I'm posing you.
That's where I was going to go if you hadn't decided to go there. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay. Background-wise, I think most of us grew up, again, hearing the pre-Columbian and post-Columbian mythology taught us in school, which I don't even think they teach anymore at all, because they don't teach history in our schools anymore.
No, they don't.
They don't even teach fairly 19th century U.S. history anymore, for the most part.
They don't teach anymore.
Right. At any rate, the academic model and myth has been for the last 2 centuries, really, in our educational system, is that there was this ancient American horse, and most of us grew up hearing about this little tiny horse called Eohippus, right? And it was about the size of a small dog or cat, supposedly. And there is, some interesting paleontology on that score. However, academics, and by the way, the subject of horses horses in the world in general is vast. It is an amazing subject. Everybody and his brother and sister have studied horses to death. But what's neat is we are always finding something new.
Yeah.
And historically, academics have said the North American horse appeared circa 3.5 million years or more or so in North America and died out. But before it died out, it made a journey. And some of them made a journey across the Bering Land Bridge, the Bering Strait Land Bridge, which they have historically, of course, taught us that human beings came out of Asia and came across the land bridge to North America, right?
Right.
Which is only very partially true, because anybody who's lived in Alaska or flown over Alaska or that territory, Alaska has 20 of the 22 tallest peaks in the Rocky Mountain Range are in Alaska. And they tell us, anciently, prehistorically, that there was upwards of 5 miles of ice on top of them. And yet we have this nice little Bering Land Bridge that's just a real causeway for people and mammals to cross back and forth. So at any rate, and so that's a topic for another show about human migration from Asia, but which is been partially is only partially true as the science moves forward. But what they're have told us is that the horse managed to make its way the other direction from America prehistorically, goes to Asia, and branches out into zebras, horses, and asses. Okay?
Yeah.
Then some period, they make their way back across the land bridge in the Pleistocene period, and they hang out here in North America, and then they suddenly disappear during what's known as the megafauna extinction circa 14,000 BC. Now, this has been the classical science on it, and this is what folks are taught in college. And so the next generation of graduates perpetuates it because as far as most academics and their new grad students, it's closed and set established science, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it happens that since 2010, a couple of genetics has brought us some very interesting findings in the last few years pertaining to the evolution of the horse and its presence in North America. The University of Copenhagen in 2010 had developed a whole new protocol, system of genetic protocols for testing, DNA testing of Pleistocene era and prehistoric fossil finds. And they ended up testing several bones of 700,000-year-old bones found in Canada. And they determined that, in fact, let me cite that for you here. They discovered that the DNA research and their mapping of the genome of what they refer to as the Yukon horse, which again dates back to 700,000 years, their research, quote, proves that woolly mammoths and prehistoric horses grazed together on the North American plains for several thousand years longer than previously thought. In other words, their genetic research was able to change the previous carbon-14 dating methods by some almost 6,000 years of correction, and that puts the presence of mammoths and horses and camels, Pleistocene camels, woolly rhinos, and so forth, into about the 10,000 before present time frame. And here's the kicker. From the Clovis research, they say the Clovis folks were here in circa 8,000 to 12,000 range. So what this really blows away, and what they're saying is these megafauna continued to exist concurrent with and interacted with human populations all during the late Pleistocene period. They go on to say that our findings show that the mammoth and horse existed side by side with the first human immigrants in America 3,500 years, and parenthetically, of mutual existence, I've added, and therefore were not wiped out by human beings or natural disasters within a few hundred years, as common theories otherwise argued. It's believed these animals were originally threatened with extinction, but they believed they survived in small, isolated herds where living conditions were suitable and intact. And they say the findings breathed new life into the debate about why saber-toothed tigers, giant sloths, woolly rhinos, mammoths suddenly disappeared from the face of the earth. Now, there in the Asian world, where horses have an evolutionary line, those horse types, many of them were what is known as three-toed or two-toed. They didn't have the classical hoof of the modern horse that we see today. In America, we had a type of horse, the American horse, is known as the stilt-legged horse, while the Asian type is referred to as the stout-legged horse. Many of your horse lovers are probably familiar with this concept. They say that the details of the horse family tree over the past 2.5 million years remains pretty poorly understood, but a group of about over a dozen renowned geneticists and paleontologists at major universities, to include the UC California Santa Cruz Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, the California State University San Bernardino, and a score of others, say that they conducted their own DNA research in 2017. So we're moving forward to the present, right? And it says the two major groups have been classified into stout-legged horses and stilt-legged horses. Both became extinct near the end of the Pleistocene in North America, but it's not clear how they related to one another. Well, a major researcher, Dr. Heinzman, showed that all stilt-legged horses, that's American, belong to a single species within its genus, referred to, and it's become known as the Harrington Hippus francisci. And it says our paleogenomic and morphometric analysis supports the idea that there was only one species of horse, middle to late Pleistocene. Horses are referred to in the Latin as equids or equidae, that it falls outside this equus group. We therefore basically say there is a new genus called Harrington Hippus which is the sole species of H. francisci, and the current mitochondrial DNA model thus suggests that the stilt-legged horse morphology arose independently in the New and Old worlds. So my summation is, ergo, they did not migrate back and forth. They did not intersect and one create the other. And so that leads us to a very interesting story, a fascinating story called the hill horse. I sometimes refer to it as the Lehigh horse. But
okay.
I had the great pleasure and opportunity to speak and interview with one of what I consider a really renowned paleontologist by the name of Rick Hunter, who has been on numerous paleontological digs in Wyoming and around the West for several decades, and he is a master at his profession. And about in September 2017, as it happens, a family by the name of Laurel and Bridger Hill, who live just off I-15 in a subdivision in a place called Lehigh, Utah, had brought in some landscapers to do some landscaping in their backyard. And as it happens, the landscapers pulled back about 6 feet of high bank sand behind their home, and lo and behold, a skeleton appeared in the soil, and they stopped their work and began to examine it. Unfortunately, the diggers had already smashed the skull, but the rest of the find was in beautiful condition and fully intact. And the Hill family, reflecting on the fact that this area in the late 1800s and forward had been pioneer farms before it became subdivisions, they assumed right away that it was probably the remains of a cow. And so they kind of worked around it, and apparently over a matter of weeks or months, some of the neighborhood kids came and filched a few bones for souvenirs here and there, and I guess they thought it was kind of cool. But here was the fascinating thing. This specimen was not fossilized. It was in its original organic state. Well, I guess a few weeks or a few months went by. Right before winter, they contacted a neighbor who happened to be a geologist with Brigham Young University up the road, and they said, "Hey, why don't you come over, Steve, and look at this thing and tell us what you think?" And so he did, and he told them right away, he said, "I don't think this is a cow. I think it may be an ancient horse or something." Said, there's a couple people you could call. And so they ended up calling a fellow by the name of Rick Hunter, a top-notch paleontologist who happens to be the chief paleontologist and I think the curator of the world's largest paleontological museum, which is called the Museum of Ancient Life, just down the road in Lehigh, Utah.
Wow.
And so,
but Ron, how did it survive without decomposition for that long?
Well, that's let me give you the Paul Harvey on that, the rest of the story. Okay. Hunter, they made a verbal agreement with Hunter and a team of his to have them come look at it, which they did, and he told them, "Wow, this is not a cow, this is a prehistoric horse." Okay? And as he's explaining to this, apparently they came to a verbal oral agreement that, hey, we're the right folks to excavate this for you. And what we'll do is we'll use the team and our money, and we will excavate it, and we will research the find and do the expensive DNA testing and analysis and further research in exchange that we can eventually put the specimen on display, okay? Mm-hmm. Which seemed to make perfect sense to me. And so originally that was what the understanding was. So Rick and his team came out, spent several days, and I think he sent me some beautiful photographs, which I've forwarded to you for the folks to view, of their excavation. They spent several days excavating it and took it to the museum down the road, and they had about 2 weeks to examine the find. In my discussions with Rick, here's how it went. They determined that, of course, this find was, of course, as I indicated, not fossilized. It was in its original organic state. So I have to explain for the audience, I got to give you a mental picture that where I-15 corridor runs north and south in Utah, the mountains are to the east or the right of it, okay? And I lived out there for a few years, so I'm very familiar with all the territory because I used to go ghost towning and fossil hunting myself all across Utah. And so the highway actually runs along the edge of what used to be ancient prehistoric Lake Bonneville, the remnant of which, part of it, is the remnant today, the Great Salt Lake. There's also a smaller pond, which we call Utah Lake. It's very sizable. But anciently, this Lake Bonneville was massive. It covered most of Utah and portion of southern Idaho and pieces of Nevada and so forth. And in places, it was 1,000 feet deep. That's enormous. And it receded and expanded 28 times over thousands of millennia. Well, what happened is, if you go to Utah today, like many other places, but particularly there, they have in Utah what they call benches. And when you live somewhere, they'll say, oh, you live up on the bench. Yeah, or the terrace, okay? Well, just think of the lake being up, 800 or 900 feet astride a mountain and then gradually receding, and it would create these steps, which we call benches, okay? And so Lehi happens to be at the very bottom of the shore level almost, where the lake has receded far away from it now. What Hunter and I believe is that, let me first describe what the horse was like in his findings so that you can appreciate what happened to it, perhaps. He says the horse was 9 to 11 years old. He explained that he found evidence of what appears to be a cancerous tumor on its right rear leg, and it had severe degenerative arthritis of the spine. So, and then he feels that the specimen was likely in the 12 to 14,000 year old range.
Whoa.
Okay, so that puts it that Pleistocene margin. Now, here's what I think will be interesting to know. If we can discover it. But let me interject that the horse has gone missing. Okay? So now comes the mystery of the missing hill horse. And by the way, Rick, paleontologists and archaeologists, one of the perks of their trade, like many others, is they get to name their finds.
Yeah.
Okay, and to identify them as they desire. And Rick was kind enough, he named the horse the Hill Horse, after the Hill family.
Yeah.
And which was pretty cool. And so here you have this horse that is basically fairly lame, right? I had a Shetland pony, Welsh Shetland pony growing up, and he was a big, tough, stocky horse, and they call them ponies, but they will tear you and mess you up. Okay, and I've also owned a Morgan quarter horse that was a registered quarter horse, and dealt with some of the leg and tissue and tumor issues that apparently this horse was plagued by. At any rate, you have this basically 10, 11-year-old horse that's suffering probably most of its life, and it's probably trying to stay up with its herd, walking or grazing along this bench area. And people can reflect back, if you go back in time, what kind of megafauna would have been roaming that area? Well, you would have had likely some giant sloth in the upper mountain areas. They typically, as in the Grand Canyon, there are hundreds of caves that were home to giant ground sloths. And paleontologists have been studying their scat for decades to understand how they managed to live in these very sparse environments. So you have sloths probably up in the hills, in the foothills. You probably have dire wolves that are about half again larger, or maybe 2 times larger than your traditional wolf today, modern wolf. You'd have, you might have some smilodons or saber-toothed tigers, but more likely large cougars. I suspect, and you never hear this, but I suspect that just as we have the remnant of the California condors today, which typically have wingspans circa 18 feet and so forth, I suspect that there were probably Rocky Mountain condors or some variant of the California that would pick off carrion and small animals as well. So this animal was probably trailing its herd, and it may have been culled by the herd by massive cougar or a wolf pack or something, and it was probably chased towards the water's edge. And in order to escape capture, it probably swam a ways out, and you can almost visualize these creatures just sitting there on the shore waiting for it to decide to come back in. And it may have well been very cold. I can imagine if you've ever been near the Salt Lake, on the shores of it during January, in the winter months, when that wind comes off that lake, waves they can get 5-6 feet, and you will freeze very quickly. Well, if it was close to winter, whether it was beginning, middle, or end, this animal probably went into hypothermia very quickly and succumbed, and it simply just sank right in with its legs almost vertical position. What's further fascinating is I don't have a picture of it, but I did see a picture that when they removed the specimen, I saw a hoof with its original golden fur still attached to the foot, as if you could, a blacksmith lifted it ready to put a horseshoe on it. That's how well preserved the specimen was. Now, because the top of it had been exposed at some point, birds or vultures had picked at it, much like they often do in Siberia to the mammoth. And you'll find the lower section of the mammoth they found several years ago when they unfroze it and ran a tube into its stomach. It bled. Thousands of year-old blood was draining out of it. And so, but they're usually typically picked off at the top, and sometimes you'll get an organic skin or remains underneath. Well, that's how nice the hoof was that I saw in the photograph. So we suspect that the horse was probably chased in there. I think there's even a possibility. Rick says this horse was probably Shetland pony size. I suspect that it might have been malnutrition. It was probably struggling to eat, so it probably wasn't real stocky and sturdy. And, a massive condor or something might have attempted to lift it even and may have dropped it, 30, 40 yards into the shoreline, and it simply couldn't get back. We just don't know, but somehow it ended up in the lake, and it went to the muddy bottom, and as the lake receded, it was beautifully preserved. So 2 weeks into their examination and preservation, by the way, to your original question, how did they save this specimen? Rick used what's called a wet sand protocol, which is you pull the specimen out, since it's organic, and you put it in wet sand, like beach sand, and you let it kind of dry out naturally, right? And that way you're trying to preserve the DNA tissue as best they can. Rick actually and his people actually went around door to door to the neighbor kids and said, "Hey, by the way, I'd like to have those bones back." And they managed to get, I think, a couple of teeth and a few bones back, and they pretty much had the whole specimen, even a few pieces of the skull and so forth to examine. So they only had it 2 weeks, and Rick and the museum had mentioned to them during the course of excavation that they needed to get a legal consent for transfer, as you can imagine, to take possession of it for research and eventual display. And so they had prepared a legal document for the Hill family to sign to, give them permission to take control and guardianship of this find. And they had a little meeting a couple weeks later, and as they met, the husband and wife of the Hill family, this verbal agreement, oral arrangement that they had kind of evaporated. And they said, "Well, we don't recall agreeing to that." And Rick, they discussed it more, and he explained, "Well, we've already invested about $5,000 in our team coming and research time, and they vacuum packed or secured the fossil find to preserve it, against oxygen degradation."
Yeah.
And so the fossil specimen was all basically prepared and at least in secure condition. And after, I guess some period of time of discussion, Rick could tell from the back and forth that this was not going to work out. And he decided that it would be in the best interest, and he mentioned to the Hills, I understand, that maybe the best thing we could do, at least in the interim, is for us to return the remains to you, and you guys can contemplate how you'd like to proceed in the future, and if you'd like us to take guardianship of it and work this, because Rick had made arrangements with some folks at University of Utah to assist with DNA analysis and microanalysis. And he had had some discussions with the Utah State paleontologists and geological group. And so he had been working with other groups to prepare for farming, teeth or other portions of it out for temporary analysis and so forth. And keep in mind, this museum, you're talking about a museum that is over 100,000 square feet, over 60 full-size raptor, Utah raptor, dinosaur specimen displays, and this is a neat place. And I hope to go visit it sometime later this year, if at all possible, or next year, because it's a beautiful museum. They even have a really upscale restaurant and all kinds of programs for the kids to learn how to not only dig fossils, but they teach kids how to plaster jacket to preserve the fossils. So they have some fabulous programs for adults and kids, and people really ought to take advantage of it, I think. But at any rate, the upshot is they returned the specimen to the Hill family. They had not spoken in a year. Curiously enough, about 2 weeks ago, I'm speaking with Rick, interviewing him on the subject, and he says, Lon, guess what? Per our discussion, or after talking to you, I think the day before or a couple of days earlier, he said, I decided to fire off an email to the Hill family, just see how they're doing. So I talked to him on that Friday. He says, Lon, you wouldn't believe it. I just got an email from the Hill family about 2 hours ago. And he said they didn't, there wasn't much there. They just answered my email like, I guess he had asked them, can you tell me anything about the status or what you're pursuing? And I guess they basically replied kind of neutrally, not giving away anything. And I guess they indicated that it's no longer in their possession.
Oh, wow.
And as we discussed the issue, Rick and I both, because I've been following this story for 18 months. I remember reading about it, back in September of 2017. So it caught my interest, and I wanted, just at the moment, I was thinking of pursuing my research into what I call the paleo horse, or the American horse. And so, bingo, here's this neat find. And so I've been following it from day one. And the other news stations in Utah just descended on the Hill family, apparently. Number of TV cameras, different stations. They were interviewed by many, many people. And this thing went viral on social media, Facebook, all over the worth. And so, as you can imagine, when somebody finds a T-Rex,
yes.
that's worth millions of dollars, right? And so, if it was any of us, and we had this specimen in our backyard, inevitably a neighbor or somebody on social media is going to say, hey, you probably hit the lottery on this horse. You better be, think about what you ought to do with it. I'm not saying this is what happened to him, but I'm speculating that this is what they had to deal with, right? And this kind of stuff pops up all the time. But I think the Hill family may have been very much interested in trying to find out more about the horse and the specimen. And having taken it back, they may have decided, maybe we should look into, or maybe they're getting offers from some people to buy it. That could happen too. But I suspect that they may have turned it over to another university or something, and by preference, could have even been BYU or something. And so, which is just up the road also, too. See, and BYU has a large faculty with large, a fair amount of capacity to examine it. So does University of Utah and others. See, so it could have gone a number of places. We just don't know where it is, and the Hill family is not saying, apparently. So,
well, the giant bones were sold to people too, and for private collections. So
many times, yes.
It easily could have been something like that. But before we run out of time, one of the stories that in reading all of this material that fascinated me tremendously was the God pot.
Oh, the God kettle.
Yeah. The
God kettle. For those folks that may be familiar with or know the map of Michigan, if you turn, and you know this from living in Michigan, one of our favorite ways of explaining people how to look at Michigan's lower peninsula is you simply look at your right hand. And it's almost exactly shaped like Michigan. And where your thumb is, we call it the thumb. And where your little finger is the thumb is on Lake Huron, of course, and on your little finger at the tip of it is a beautiful town called Traverse City. And its shoreline formed off the edge of Lake Michigan. And in fact, Sleeping Bear Dunes at Empire, which is right next to Leelanau, Michigan, just 20, 30 miles above Traverse City, has been named by National Geographic as the most beautiful place in America, for those who care. But at any rate, at Traverse City, Michigan, it has a peninsula that juts between it and what's called Little Grand Traverse Bay. So you have like a finger that juts out, and that's a huge peninsula. And then there's this bay, and in the middle of the bay, just on the edge of Traverse, is a place called Mission Peninsula. And that's another finger that shoots out about 20 miles into Lake Michigan, or what's known as Little Traverse Bay. So you go back in time to 1838, or 1837, excuse me. Michigan became a state in 1837. And incidentally, it was my wife's great uncle, Lucius Lyon, who was the first senator of Michigan, who helped resolve in Congress the Toledo Line War in exchange for the Upper Peninsula, and so that the Ohioans wanted Toledo as a port. So he managed to negotiate it in Congress so that Michigan could become a state in 1837. Prior to that, and during that period, Mackinac Island, just above the tip of your finger, where the Mackinac Bridge is today, the largest suspension bridge in America, 5 miles, Mackinac Island was the fur trading capital of the world historically, and in the early 1800s, it was John Jacob Astor who owned most of it and set up his fur company there. So a lot of people, it was part of the North, they were seeking the Northwest Passage to the West Coast and the Pacific. And so many people during the late 1700s, early 1800s were pioneer explorers coming, and they would often come to Mackinac and try to familiarize themselves with the territory. At any rate, one of the people that came in 1837 was a man named Reverend Doherty. And Doherty was a Presbyterian reverend, and he brought a friend with him, and they sailed over to Mackinac Island first, and then around the curve down towards what would eventually become Traverse City. And he sailed into East Grand Traverse Bay in March of 1837, I believe it was. And as he sailed into the bay, they dropped anchor, and he departed the ship with his friend, another reverend, and they saw this teepee on the shoreline, and they noticed across the peninsula, part of the peninsula was this beautiful apple orchard. And so they got in a small dinghy, rowed to the shore, and came upon this fellow, and they introduced themselves, and he spoke English, having picked it up from some trappers apparently, and his name was Chief Agosa, and they became very close friends. And Doherty brought his wife a few months later, and they created what was called the mission school. They created a mission school, and he began to teach Chief Agosa and his tribal men carpentry. And within 2 years, they were building their own houses. And they pretty much grew away from their temporary bark lodges and so forth. At any rate, over the ensuing 10 or 12 years, they were very much trusted, of course, and they had a feast festival, according to Doherty's diaries, that on one occasion, Chief Agosa took him into the forests of Mission Peninsula, and at that time, we had forests here, and I have a tree that's up against our house that's 120 feet high, and its sister tree is a foot away, and it's about 100 feet tall, and they are white pines. They're the same tree that were used for sailing masts on the clipper ships. And this entire region was covered in them, and with massive oaks and maples. And so when Chicago burned, had the Chicago fire in 1871, it is common knowledge here in this region that they say Antrim County, Michigan, rebuilt Chicago. They literally leveled the forests here and flooded Lake Michigan with timber logs and random rafts all the way to Chicago, and rebuilt Chicago after the fire of 1871. And by the way, as an aside, in my research about 6 years ago, I discovered the real cause of the Chicago fire. It turns out that night of the Chicago fire was the largest fiery meteor storm recorded in America that night. It was, people talk about, there were a few hundred people that obviously died in the Chicago fire. What most Americans don't know is that we lost almost 8,000 people in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, that same night, burned an entire town and everyone in it, such that relatives did not know that their family was gone until people drove into town in wagons and saw it leveled and charcoal remains everywhere.
Lon, we've only got 10 minutes to go.
Okay. Give me 1 minute here. It also burned the lumber mills of Manistee and Alpena, Michigan. So Doherty is taken into the forest by Chief Agosa, and he is astonished because they have prepared a giant elk, a massive elk, in this massive 8-foot copper kettle. And he describes this kettle as being 8 feet in circumference, and they could cook an entire elk or bear inside it. And it had a few strange markings on it. but it had no lip and no rings on the sides. And he asked Chief Agosa, how did your people create this massive copper kettle? And he said, his response was, our people did not create it. It was left to us by our ancient fathers. Our people found it embraced by massive trees several, what he would have termed, centuries before, and their people took possession of this massive copper kettle, which Doherty came to call the God kettle because it was so massive. And so flash forward about 10 or 15 years, Chief Agosa passed away, and a new chief gained authority in the tribe named Chief Kewadin, and there's a small town in next to Elk Rapids there above Trapper City called Kewadin. And Chief Kewadin, from what we can discern, apparently traded the kettle to a farmer for some blankets and a horse. Here's the sad Paul Harvey. Elk Rapids became America's first, in fact, I think it was first in the world. They created the first plant for creating turpentine and kerosene and chemicals that they were shipping to Germany for several decades. And they created their own processes, a mill, and they burned, they deforested the area and took that wood and lumber to serve as charcoal to fire the mills. Well, a few years later, in comes an iron pot and pan factory, and they're smelting ore and making pots and pans and other things. And it appears that no one seems to know what happened to the God kettle, but I suspect the farmer probably said, aha, here's, they probably paid him couple $100 for the copper, and it probably got smelted down, unfortunately. So this is how stuff just disappears. So, and that's the name of that tune, as they say.
Well, it's a great story, and from what I understood, it when they discovered it, it didn't appear that it had been used at all.
Right. Agosa said that when they discovered it, there were saplings growing out of it because detritus and soil and dirt had accumulated over, some large period of time, and they actually scooped it out and managed to extricate the kettle from the embrace of these large trees. I think I did an author's sketch for the article in Ancient American back in December of 2017, so there is my rendering of what it may have looked like when long ago.
It's just, it's stuff like this that makes you so sad that something that had such great historical relevance, disappears. Just as the hill horse. I mean, you get a glimpse of your past, and then suddenly it's destroyed, or it's hidden, or it disappears, or and then you have nothing to go on to prove that it was actually there, other than I heard about it, I read about it, or I saw an article about it. And the history in this country is so rich and so phenomenal. Yes. And it's a history that would make history fun and intriguing to learn. And
I think so.
And yet, oh my goodness, yes. I mean, the garden beds are phenomenal. I still can't figure out, of course, maybe they did have horses, how they took care of them. I mean, the way they planted, there was no they didn't have to worry about weeds because, of course, the leaves of the pumpkins and the squash would choke out any weed. So,
right.
it was so brilliantly done, and then suddenly it stopped.
Well, and that's the dot that I'm trying to connect in all this research, is that there is no way, even 1,000 people in a general area, there's no way they could have created these garden beds simply by human labor of hoeing them into shape, 100 acres of these things. They had to have draft animals, and they had horses. And hopefully you'll be able to upload that picture of the several thousand-year-old archaic plowhead, which is sitting in the Lansing Historical Museum in Lansing, Michigan. And it's 3 feet long, and it has an angular recess to receive a wooden handle, and it must weigh close to 30 pounds. And yet the archaeologists who have it on display are calling it an axe head. And so... Well, so it's a plow.
Well,
it's an ancient plow.
I'll take all of your pictures, and they'll be a part of the YouTube presentation that will go up tomorrow. All of the pictures will be there, so that people can get a chance of looking at and seeing a lot of what we've been talking about. I want to thank you so much for taking such a great amount of time and sharing with us all of this, because history comes alive when you see stuff like this, and when people do watch, the YouTube presentation for sure, they can see all of the different kinds of configurations of the beds that are out there, and it's phenomenal. It's to think that thousands of years ago or 1,000 years ago, people in this country were doing stuff like that. They were not just, digging little ditches and growing herbs and stuff for their own, consumption. It was mass producing.
Barely existing. Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to note that they recently found similar geometric beds in Luxor, Egypt, and the Zuni Nation. I think I have a picture in there of the Zuni Nation in New Mexico they farm Three Sisters, and they farm in a geometry near their villages as well.
Seems to me we could learn a lot from the past, but we're down to our last seconds here. Thank you so much. I so appreciate this, and I'm going to have you back on again.
Well, it was a delight to be with you, Barbara, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share it with people.
Oh, you're so welcome. And everybody, tune in tomorrow.